everyone, this is Eve Picker, and if you listen to this podcast series, you're going to learn how to make some change. Hi there. Thanks so much for joining me today for the latest episode of Impact Real Estate Investing. My guest today is Sadie McKeown, Executive VP and Chief Operating Officer of CPC, the Community Preservation Organization. There she oversees the company's construction, lending, and sustainability initiatives. And she also oversees the operation of its regional field offices located throughout New York State. And finally, she leads CPC's agency lending subsidiary, a full-service operation focusing on Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, and FHA lending products. Sadie has been involved in community development for over 25 years. It's rare to meet someone who still loves their job and the company they work for after all that time, but Sadie does. No one understands the dynamics of community and the role that leadership and politics plays in whether a community thrives or dies better than Sadie. Be sure to go to evepicker.com to find out more about Sadie on the show notes page for this episode. And be sure to sign up for my newsletter so you can access information about impact real estate investing and get the latest news about the exciting projects on my crowdfunding platform, Small Change. Sadie, thanks for joining me today. You and I had started a conversation a few weeks back that was really pretty fascinating, the politics of community development. And I'd love to explore that with you today. How much impact does politics have on whether a community thrives or not? But first, just a little bit of background. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks very much for having me on your podcast. It's my first.
It's a pleasure. So I read that you've worked for Community Preservation Corporation, CPC, for quite a while now. So you must love it there. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the nonprofit and what you work on there.
Sure. So yeah, it's been a long time. I started at CPC back in 1991 as an intern. And I really did fall in love with the company and the mission. CPC occupies a very unique space. We are a not-for-profit, but we are fully self-sustaining, so we don't take grants or government assistance. We're a construction and permanent lender for affordable multifamily housing primarily, but we also do a lot of economic development and downtown revitalization. And we are mostly a New York State and city-based company, although we have a mortgage company that does lending for Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae on a national basis, as well as FHA. But today I'll focus on our community development and the construction lending that we do. We started in New York City in 1974 at a time when the Bronx was burning, and there was tremendous amount of disinvestment in neighborhoods in New York City. Manufacturing jobs were leaving. There was white flight to the suburbs, and a lot of neighborhoods in New York fell on hard times. And so CPC was created by David Rockefeller when he was the chair of Chase Manhattan Bank at the time.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Yeah. He got together with some of the other commercial bankers in the city and said, we have to do something about this crisis and really stem the tide of disinvestment and abandonment in New York City. And so CPC was created. We started pretty small in a couple of stable neighborhoods. We were successful. And then Mayor Koch came in and started the 10-year housing plan. And CPC was pulled up to the next level to do a lot of vacant building construction, renovation, and permanent financing. And the way it worked was that the banks would come together and make the construction loans on a pari passu risk-sharing basis, and they would also forward commit a 30-year permanent loan to take out those construction loans when the projects were completed and fully leased. And it was great, and we started in Harlem and the South Bronx and Bedford-Stuy and neighborhoods that really needed a tremendous amount of investment. And it was decided that more was required to get at the scale of the need. So we worked in partnership with New York City, utilizing their tax subsidy programs, their vacant building stock, and their subsidies in conjunction with our first mortgages to do the construction piece. And then we went to the New York City and eventually the state pension funds and they agreed to buy our 30-year fixed rate permanent loans because they were insured by the state of New York Mortgage Agency. So we created this very special product back in the late 70s that has served the state of New York and the city of New York very well, because it's provided certainty in the financing world with a 30-year fixed rate non-recourse loan with a forward committed interest rate. And so we took a lot of the risk out of real estate, which was necessary, I should say, the risk out of real estate construction financing, which was necessary because we were in what banks would consider to be the riskiest neighborhoods. So lots of vacant buildings, low rents, uncertain demand. And we did that in partnership with subsidy programs in New York City primarily. But then when we expanded to upstate New York with all of the different municipalities across the state. And so, we know community development on a large scale. Yeah. We also know it on a really small scale because some of the municipalities we work in outside of New York City are pretty small. So we have a pretty special lens where we really go in and meet with municipalities and we talk to them about what their housing priorities are. We look at what they have in their housing stock and what they might need. And you can imagine it's upstate New York and New York City. There's a lot of historic buildings. There's a lot of old manufacturing buildings. So we get to do a lot of really cool deals that preserve what was there 100 years ago and bring it back as something new. So we preserve the cosmetics of it and the place of it, but we get to interject, financing to make it something new. So housing, offices, retail, the whole concept of live, work, and play in downtown and transit-oriented developments. We've gotten to invest in a lot of communities that are focused on that. And so it's like I said, it's a very unique company, CPC, because we're not a bank. So we're not regulated the way banks are. So we have more flexibility. We're more nimble. And, we partner with government, but we're not burdened in the same way that government is burdened. And I don't...
Sounds fabulous.
Yeah, it's really cool.
So what's the most fascinating part of your job for you?
So I guess the most fascinating part of the job is when you go to a place or you go to a project that a developer wants to do, and it's a vacant building or it's a distressed neighborhood, and most people would only see the negative and they wouldn't want to be in that place. And I remember early on with my clipboard as a loan officer at CPC, I would be on, some of the worst blocks in the neighborhoods that we were making loans in, thinking every other person I know in my life would get in their car and drive away as fast as they possibly could.
That's true. I love those places.
Yeah, me too. And yet there I was waiting for an opportunity to make a difference, to create change. And lots of times what CPC does is we're first in with our capital, and we create excitement with the first 2 or 3 or 4 projects. And then all of a sudden, there's projects going up that we're not financing because other investment is coming in. So I think your investments are really much more than an investment into a project. They're an investment into a community so that other developers feel more comfortable following, right? Absolutely. And that's one of our big priorities, is to create an investment environment which will attract other capital, both equity capital as well as other debt capital.
Yeah, that's really, really tough to do.
It is tough to do, but I think that's my favorite part of the job, is when you get to that point and you start to see other investment coming in, you've been successful.
What's your biggest success story?
So, New York City is a huge success story for CPC, but it's too big for us to claim. So I'm going to go...
I would just claim it.
I'm going to go further north along the Hudson River and talk about a small city called Beacon. And Beacon, New York is a population of probably about 20,000. It's a former industrial city right on the Hudson River, which thrived before the Newburgh-Beacon Bridge, before cars. It had a lot of manufacturing, and there was a lot of boat traffic up and down the river. Beautiful historic buildings, a really interesting long Main Street, an interesting downtown, and just a really neat place. When CPC started making loans there at the end of, in the beginning of the 1990s, 89, 90, 91, it was all vacant buildings, prostitution, drugs. It was not a place that you wanted to be.
Isn't this where Pete Seeger lived?
Yes, in the Hudson Valley. Pete Seeger lived up that way, absolutely. And so the mayor at the time, and this goes to your point about politics and community development, was really focused. Her name was Clara Lou Gould, and she was really focused on trying to transform the downtown and the Main Street and bring it back. Because what often happens to main streets that don't come back, and this is going back, to urban renewal, sometimes you can lose the history because you just get rid of you erase the problem by demolishing buildings and you start over because you think that might be the best way forward. And it's certainly one way forward, and you can do lots of interesting and new and exciting things. But in cities like Beacon, you want to be able to preserve that history because the buildings themselves are beautiful. And so we literally would go door to door, knocking on the doors. And these were all small multifamily buildings, 2 or 3 apartments above a store, figure out who owned the buildings. And then, in partnership with the city of Beacon, because they knew who owned these buildings as well. And we would sit the people down and say, okay, you can borrow money from CPC. We'll get money from, Dutchess County. We'll get money from the Federal Home Loan Bank, from the local utility company. We'll get, a city of Beacon will give us a grant. And we married together all of these subsidies, and we were able to do about 25 different projects in the concentrated Main Street area.
Oh, that's a lot. Be sure to go to evepicker.com and sign up for my free educational newsletter about impact real estate investing. You'll be among the first to hear about new projects you can invest in. That's evepicker.com. Thanks so much. Well, it's actually a pretty long Main Street, but it's a small town.
Yes, and all of the buildings themselves were really small. So what we would do uniquely there that other banks wouldn't do is actually finance 4 units above a store that would take 3 or 4 years to complete. We didn't make any money as an organization, but because we're mission driven, it didn't matter. CPC always does a blend of different types of deals, and we service all the loans that we underwrite and close so that we're making money in other places, which allows us to go in and concentrate investment. It's like Beacon. So over 10 years, we provided about $5 million of private financing from CPC in these different projects, very small average loan size, like $200,000 or $300,000. And then another $3 million was leveraged in all different sources of public subsidy. We did about 32 storefronts with that $5 million and about 120 apartments. And
that's incredibly efficient. That's incredibly efficient, Sadie.
Yeah, well, it didn't feel efficient at the time. But what happened was, we created, and there were some pioneers. I want to give credit to Ron and Ronnie Beth Sowers, who were a couple that lived up there and were the pioneers that did the first couple of deals. And there, we started to create a buzz and people started to come to Beacon because it's a beautiful place and the Metro North train from New York City stops there. And all of a sudden, people were coming in and buying up the other vacant buildings. And then there were a lot of artists there. And then Dia Beacon opened. And Dia is a large modern art museum that was put into a vacant warehouse down by the river. And it's just fabulous. It's a fabulous, fabulous art museum. And it attracted a lot of attention and more people came. And, so we started in the early 90s. By 2004 or 5, say, we sort of stopped making loans there because other banks were there. So we were successful. We kind of worked ourselves out of a job. We still do some financing there, but we brought back a lot of other capital. Now, I hadn't been in Beacon for 8 years. And my husband and I went for a hike across the river, and we were on our way back. And I said, let's drive through Beacon. I hear great things. I want to see it. When we parked the car and walked from one end of Main Street to the other, I was absolutely stunned at the activity and the stores and the restaurants and the people. And it was I was literally had the chills because, but for that initial capital that we took the risk investing there, it may not have happened, or it may have taken a lot longer to happen. And so that was a wonderful story for us.
That is a wonderful story. So, I'm very fond of Newburgh, fond and sad about Newburgh, which is across the river, which has enormous potential and is full of very beautiful buildings, architecturally significant buildings. But that, in the same period of time, hasn't had the same story, has it?
No, it hasn't. And when CPC opened its Hudson Valley office in 1989 or 90, we decided to target cities because it's easier to target than to just spray small loans all over the place. So we targeted Beacon, Newburgh, and Poughkeepsie in the mid-Hudson Valley as our 3 cities where we would concentrate investment. And so you heard my story about Beacon. Well, I spent as much time in Newburgh as I did in Beacon, but without the same results. And there's a couple of reasons for that I'll talk about. But before I talk specifically about Newburgh, because I too love Newburgh the same way you do, and I'm very much a believer in Newburgh. It's just going to take a little bit longer. But when CPC evaluates whether or not there's investment potential in a place, we look at 5 criteria. So we look at the physical infrastructure and we say, what are the buildings like? Are there opportunities for us to be here and invest here? And clearly that's the case in Newburgh. Beautiful physical infrastructure, the streets, the river. So there is definitely beautiful physical infrastructure. Then we look at the social infrastructure. Is there a there? Is there a reason why people would want to go there and live there and eat and dine and play there? And a little bit less so in Newburgh, but certainly the potential was there.
Yeah, the potential is huge. Broadway's an amazing street.
Exactly. So we said, we checked that box, social, that's great, that's awesome. And then we said, what does the economic infrastructure look like? And that it started to get a little bit more challenging in Newburgh because the economics were tough. Rents are low and taxes are high. And so it's very hard to leverage a lot of private debt to make deals work. But Orange County was committed to Newburgh. They had their home funds. This was, 25, 30 years ago. So there was a source from the federal government to use. And so, we thought we could put deals together. The tax credit program was just coming online. So we had some resources to help the economics. So that was good. And then you look at the development infrastructure. Are there people there that are doing development that care about the place and that want to see things happen? This has always been true about Newburgh. Just like you and me, Eve, people love Newburgh.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
There's always a core of people that are trying to make things happen. So that gave us confidence too. Now that core has changed over time. There was a group called the Newburgh Development Association that used to host monthly lunches, and we'd all get together in a little restaurant on Broadway, and we'd talk about the challenges, whether it was facades or parking or infrastructure, whatever it was. And then we talk about how to resolve this. So I always felt good about the development infrastructure. But then you always have to look at the political infrastructure of a place, because if there isn't political will to do what needs to be done, it's very challenging. And so I'll go back over to Beacon for a second and say that Clara Lou Gould was the mayor when CPC got started in 1990, and she remained the mayor for the next 23 years.
Wow.
And so her agenda for revitalizing her main street remained her agenda for that long. And the more you do something, the better you get at it. And the more you can attract attention to what you're doing, the more resources come to you. And so politically, she was a stalwart and she wanted this. And that very thing happened. More and more people came to Beacon. More and more people wanted to invest. And they had a welcoming presence in the government of the city of Beacon, led by Clara Lou Gould. So, it's not easy to develop in these small cities. There's a lot of things to consider.
And I would say, as an architect and urban designer, if I look at those 2 cities, Newburgh is by far the more interesting in terms of its building stock and streetscapes. Beacon is not as interesting as Newburgh. So the political piece has been extremely important for Beacon.
I completely agree.
Well, except for the fact that there's a direct train link to New York, and that probably is really important too.
I was just going to say the exact same thing. So the other thing that Beacon has going for it is that the Metro North train does stop there. And as crazy as that may seem to some people, people really do get on the train in Beacon and go to New York City for work every day, even though that train ride is it's probably an hour and 10 or an hour and 20.
I've done it. It's an hour and 15 minutes, but it's lovely. You can sit and read and work. It's really lovely. The crazy thing is, this is where segregation comes into play a little bit as well. I always wonder about the bridge between those 2 cities and why it doesn't land in the middle of Newburgh and over to one side instead, because it's really very close. It's just across the river. Yeah.
It's interesting. So back to the politics of Newburgh, I think in the time that CPC was working there, maybe there were 6 different mayors. And so what you have is a lack of focus on what your agenda is and a concentrated focus on staying in office or running for office. And so, because you don't, without the continuity, there's uncertainty. And so people that would come in with all of the greatest ideas in the world never had the same kind of certainty because there was never one strategy led by a strong leader around how to redevelop the city. A couple of other things, similar to the train that I want to say, because it's not just politics, didn't help in Newburgh politics, but Newburgh also is much larger geographically than Beacon, the downtown.
Yes.
And huge. So you need more to have an impact, right? And so that was a challenge. Yeah. And it's where there is the largest concentration of poverty in Orange County.
Yep.
And Beacon didn't have the largest concentration of poverty, even though it had a concentration. Poughkeepsie did. And so this is going to sound wrong, but there was less competition for poor people in Beacon than there is in Newburgh, where the poor people tend to migrate. So you have to address that also. And addressing that, you can't just address that with good housing or with storefronts and restaurants. You have to address that with jobs and transportation, and true economic revitalization. And I think that that's even harder to do than housing. Physical infrastructure, making improvements to the multifamily building, the historic, beautiful multifamily building stock that's there is really important, and that's one piece. But you need to be able to provide income for the residents that are going to live there and opportunity. And that's so much harder to get at. It's easy to change the physical infrastructure of your place, but to change the economic environment is that much harder. And if you don't even have political leadership that can get to the low-hanging fruit of the physical change, it's really going to be hard to get to the economic change. And I think Newburgh has struggled a little bit more. In Beacon, you had Dutchess County, which had lost IBM and lost a ton of jobs. The county was very focused on diversifying their labor force and making broad change so that they weren't relying on one entity to support them, which was IBM before IBM left Dutchess County. So you had a county-wide effort to change, and Beacon got to participate in that. That wasn't the case in Orange County because Orange County didn't suffer the same economic devastation when one employer left. So Newburgh didn't have anything to sort of grab onto or to get help with. They were sort of on their own. So over the last 30 years, you haven't seen that much change in Newburgh. But, and there's always a but when you're talking about Newburgh.
Yes.
It does feel like things are really starting to happen.
Well, when you talk about employers, I mean, that has really shifted in the last 5 years. I mean, more and more people are working remotely. I run a virtual company, have people all over the world for my company, and it's really quite manageable and quite enjoyable because we have the technology to be able to talk like we're talking on Zoom now in many other ways, and it's very simple. So as people move towards the sort of remote employment, the likelihood of a more remote place being occupied goes up a little bit, right?
I couldn't agree more. And I think Newburgh is well positioned for that kind of opportunity. Because if you need to get to the city, you can go over the bridge and for a meeting once a week or something, but you can be extraordinarily productive, remotely. And there could be small hubs of, WeWork spaces or Regis offices that employ people so that they can come together in collaborative spaces. But you don't have to be in New York City anymore to work for a company that's located in New York City. So I think Newburgh is well positioned for that. But
and that actually may be, one of the things that helps the affordable housing crisis, the fact that people can work from a more affordable place is a really good thing.
Absolutely. And the fact that they don't have to spend money commuting helps their affordability. So
that's right.
Remote working is one part of the solution.
Years ago, there was a foundation here in Pittsburgh where I live that tried to start they actually did a survey on the civic skills of elected officials and what they understood about placemaking and housing and all of these things. And the scores were extremely poor. So, one wonders whether, elected officials shouldn't go to some sort of school that might help them a little bit. They're elected based on personality and charm and really may not have the right skill set to help the community.
Yeah, I agree with that. I live in a small village just north of New York City on the Hudson River, south of Beacon. And I feel very blessed to live in the village that I live in. We've had the same mayor for 20 years, but we have a very forward-thinking agenda in Tarry. I live in Tarrytown, New York. And so we did a comprehensive plan where we brought in the people from the village and we got feedback on what our priorities are. And then instead of having that sit on the shelf, we created a comprehensive plan management committee to look at what came out of that plan and make sure that we followed up on it. A village like Tarrytown has a part-time mayor and one village administrator who has an assistant, and that's kind of it. You have your village engineer and your administrative people, but there's not a lot of people that can really move that agenda forward. So you really need volunteers. And I'm a volunteer in the village on the housing committee and on the comp plan committee. You really need volunteers that care about a place to come forward and participate in its development and in what it becomes. And I think that, politicians need to do more of that. There's also a program in Hudson Valley called the Land Use Leadership Alliance, which is run through Pace University's law school, where they bring in all of the planning and zoning people from the various towns in the Hudson Valley once a year for a 6 or 8 part series, educational series.
Oh, that's great.
Teaching them about placemaking, about zoning, about architecture, about financing, so that when they're sitting behind a table evaluating whether or not a project should be approved or a library should be extended or whatever it is, they have a perspective and a sense of how that impacts the whole community and what it takes to get a development done or to raise funds for a library or a park or whatever it is. And so I completely agree with you. The education, and there are mayors that go through the LULA program, and there are trustees and all of the people that make decisions at the local level participate, and they participate with each other. So there's different people from different towns. And it's actually a really cool thing.
It's very cool. It's very cool.
I've been a speaker at it, and I've sat in on a number of their sessions, and it's actually a very enlightened way to bring people together in a non-threatening environment that's not political at all, where they don't care about anything other than learning how to do best for the place that they live.
And, you're working all over New York State like this. Is this the only, example like this? I mean, you said you look at 5 things when you evaluate, 5 criteria when you evaluate whether to work somewhere and order to invest in a project. And of those 5 criteria, what most frequently lets you down?
Well,
or is it all over the place?
It's all over the place. It really depends. So if we are in a city just outside of New York City, so in the suburban ring, lower Westchester County, you have great economics, typically great physical infrastructure, social, there's population density. What you really need there is good politics and also good development infrastructure. So in New Rochelle, New York, which is just north of the Bronx in Westchester County, we had the good fortune of being brought in. New Rochelle was developed, one of the first cities developed outside of New York, about 100 plus years ago. And it was like a summer community for people that lived in Manhattan. And so it was the first Bloomingdale's outside of New York City. And the Main Street was thriving with merchants and everything else. It was really quite a wonderful city, and then fell on hard times. And the offices went to office parks in Westchester County, and stores, and large stores in particular, went to malls. And so downtowns like New Rochelle, which made no sense that they fell on hard times because of their proximity to New York City, fell on hard times. And so, when we were called in to look at the financing for this Bloomingdale's building, which had been vacant for 25 years, and we were pulled in by the director of their business improvement district, a guy named Ralph DeBart, who we knew. He had been involved in Soho, became Soho, and he had been involved in some other cities, and we knew him well. And we came in and we looked at the Bloomingdale's building, and they couldn't get financing. And we said, well, why can't you get financing? They said, well, the banks won't do it because there are no comps. And I laughed and said, that's the best thing about this project. There are no comps in the immediate area, but there are lots of comps because the woman that bought it wanted to develop loft housing. She stole a design from Chelsea, New York, and was going to do the exact same thing on Main Street in New Rochelle. And instead of it costing at the time, this was the early 2000s, instead of it costing $850,000, she was going to charge $225,000. So from my perspective, we had great comps because everybody wants to live in Chelsea. They just can't afford to.
Right.
So if you wanted to be in that style of housing, it didn't exist in New Rochelle. So that was a place where, our lens of turning risk up on its head really made sense. She built that project. She bought the building and built out and sold that project in 22 months.
Yeah.
Incredible.
I did a similar thing in downtown Pittsburgh. At a time, I built 8 lofts in downtown in a vacant building at a time when the banker actually said to me, oh, honey, no one's going to live down here. And I sold them all before I finished construction.
Exactly.
So people really, they want something more than cookie cutter, options for how to live. They deserve more. So yeah, it's frustrating when banks don't, or lending institutions don't really see those innovative opportunities.
Agreed. And what was really, really cool about New Rochelle is that was our watershed deal. That was the first one that we did. It put us on the map, if you will. And then because Ralph DeBart was there, the president of CPC at the time said to me, you can do this big deal, Sadie, but look around. And you looked up and down Main Street, it was really small buildings. And he said, these guys have been hanging in here in New Rochelle, owning their buildings, keeping their businesses alive, and they're the ones that are really struggling. We have to create a program that meets everybody's needs, not just the bigger deals. So working alongside of Ralph, we created a facade improvement program. We created a technical assistance grant program where we could, because when they zoned for Bloomingdale's, they did blanket zoning for the entire business improvement district as of right residential above the stores. But store owners said, that's great. And I have my store here and I own the building and I have vacant office space upstairs, but I don't know what I can do with it. And I don't want to spend money to find out. So CPC did technical assistance grants to bring in an engineer to say, okay, you have X number of square feet. You can do 3 loft style apartments and they'll be this big. And, and so then as the loan officer, I could say, okay, so the rent for those 3 apartments will be X and the rent from your store is Y. And so we can leverage this much money in private financing to give you a construction loan to go ahead and renovate that empty office space and turn it into beautiful lofts. And that happened. And that was really cool. But it was really Ralph and I together, over pizza or coffee or Indian food, talking about what would it take to get the facade improvement, the facades to improve, the lofts to be developed. How could we work with the smaller owners? And what was great about Ralph was he knew who was serious and had capacity to do it, and he knew who was a little too nutty. And so he protected me from the nuts because you can get into a deal with a nut and it could take, 3 years later, you come out and your head is spinning.
Yeah.
Not that they're not wonderful and creative people. They're just, even I can't bank them. Right. So it was great to have, and that's that development infrastructure piece. So that alongside of really good politics, you end up with real good boots on the ground, which is a thing that we talk about at CPC. In order to know your neighborhoods, you got to have boots on the ground. And I spent 20 years as a loan officer at CPC. I was boots on the ground and I walked every block in the neighborhoods that I was in. And I knew them really well. And I knew who owned what, and I knew where the opportunities were and where the problems were. And so having that development partner, that infrastructure, I think was really important. So New Rochelle is another success story. We've done great things in Syracuse and Rochester and Buffalo. Those are the larger cities. And now we're starting to see activity in some of the smaller tier cities like Utica and Binghamton. And that's really cool too. And so, we have a great governor that has dedicated a lot of resources to housing, has a real interest in developing upstate New York and economic development. And what we do is we look at where the resources are and how we can follow the money, if you will, to make things happen in conjunction with whatever resources are available in a place. A deal came to our mortgage committee the other day in Buffalo, and it was yet another vacant former industrial building, and it was a brownfield site. And I laughed and I said to the loan officer in Buffalo, it's follow the contamination, because it's such a great resource and there aren't that many resources. So you have to go where there are resources.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. So
anyway, it's wonderful to hear you're so excited about this job after being there for such a long time.
Yeah. Oh, I love my job.
That's
very,
really,
very lucky.
Very lucky. Yeah. So I just talking a little bit more broadly, I'm just wondering if you think socially responsible real estate is necessary today in today's development landscape.
Absolutely. I think it's necessary in every day and every year. And to the extent that we haven't done it, we should have been doing it. We certainly should do it going forward. I'm a little curious if your definition of socially responsible real estate is similar to mine. So why don't you tell me what yours is?
Well, we have a definition on small change, which is kind of pretty broad and a little agnostic. I think socially responsible could mean an ugly building that's converted into a business incubator for startups in an underserved building. It could equally well also be a net zero passive modular house that is built on a long vacant site in a good neighborhood that is expensive. It's not always, I mean, I know everyone talks about affordable housing, but I think for me, impact in real estate can mean a variety of things. I think it's a level of thoughtfulness so that you just don't spend money doing a deal for the deal's sake, but you add some value to the community you're in. Does that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense. And it is definitely very consistent with my definition. I would say at CPC, we really do that. As it relates to sustainability and passive house and net zero, we've been pushing to try to get the first mortgage market to incorporate energy performance of a building into their underwriting so that they're recognizing how much less expensive it is to operate those properties so that we can leverage additional net operating.
That's fantastic because that's really been missing.
Yeah, it has been missing. It's been a real battle, a labor of love. But we really believe in passive house principles and net zero and decarbonization, electrification, because it makes housing more affordable. It makes it more resilient in the era of climate change. And it makes it a better living environment, better tenant outcomes, more tenant comfort. It's a much healthier environment for a tenant to live in. So for
by the same token, housing that is close to transit is also pretty meaningful in the affordability game, right? So if someone lives somewhere where they're close to some sort of transit hub and they don't have to buy a car and they don't have to drive their car to work, that's pretty meaningful, and that should also count in that.
It absolutely does. It totally counts. Transit-oriented development, downtown revitalization, those are all things that we also focus on. And then, we do a lot of what we call big A, subsidized affordable, like bread and butter, government subsidized affordable housing for very, very poor people. We do homeless housing, supportive housing. We do all of that really good, deep mission-based stuff. And that's all really wonderful. But we also do, when we're talking about downtowns, we try to do integrated housing so that it's not just mixed with, retail and office if that's appropriate, but that the incomes are mixed. And we look very broadly at housing and how it gets built and constructed. And we're very concerned about the rising costs of constructing housing. Because there's not a rising subsidy pool alongside of it to offset those rising costs. So to your point about modular, we are very interested in modular approaches that drive down the cost, the hard cost of construction, shorten the amount of time it takes to build so that you're shortening your overall development time frame, and the ability to try to build some of that passive or net zero so that you're delivering boxes to the site that are really the highest quality relative to their sustainability. And, if you can do that and you can work with a municipality to get your approvals and to create a routine program, there are ways to integrate affordability into a building with maybe just a tax abatement, and maybe if you're buying land from a municipality for $1, those two things, you can integrate 30-40% affordability into a market rate project without capital subsidy. And that's something else that we're very, very focused on, because there's just not a lot of capital subsidy available. But we also, we will work alongside of, any program. So like I mentioned brownfield tax credits before, historic tax credits. We're doing a deal in South Carolina now that has textile credits. My idea is been with the low-income housing tax credit, we should add a boost for anybody that's going to make their building net zero or passive or electrified, and give them a little bit extra credit to try to raise additional capital to make that building, to maximize its energy efficiency, its resiliency, and its sustainability. So, we're always thinking about how to do things differently, not just doing the same thing over and over again. And I think that's consistent.
Pretty wonderful. So are there any current trends in real estate that you think are the most important for the future of our cities?
Well, when you look at the nexus of climate change and the affordable housing crisis, I think that will be a trend, depending on politics, of course. We were headed in that direction under the last administration and President Obama, where we were in the Paris Agreement. And, I've been to the Netherlands, where they take this very seriously. There are lots of creative ways for capitalism to go to work, making housing more affordable and addressing climate crisis. I often want very much for the different departments of governments to collaborate on how to solve problems together. So housing affordability and sustainability in the climate crisis really cross over. So I really feel like the resources available to make housing more resilient, and also healthcare is another one. There's some really cool stuff happening in places like Connecticut around, hospitals and healthcare providers participating in affordable housing. So I think we're starting to see a trend where it's not just a silo of we all do 9% tax credits and let's just keep doing them. I think people, because of the looming affordable housing crisis, are starting to get out of the box, which I think is very exciting.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's very exciting. Very exciting.
One of the things that I think about all the time, people talk about infrastructure in this country and they think roads and bridges. When I think about infrastructure, I think about money and financing. And I think about financing being the infrastructure that underpins everything. And so if you can influence how things are financed, you can touch everything. You can touch every physical building in the country, because not everyone, but the majority have financing. And so, that's sort of one.
That plays into a question I have to ask is, do you think that crowdfunding has a role in that?
I just love crowdfunding, and I love your approach, and I love your concept. I had the great privilege of listening to you speak those few weeks ago.
Thank you.
And, what I love most about the crowdfunding is that it opens the door for many, many, many more investors and people that live in places to invest in the place that they live. Right now, most people just have an opportunity to invest in their 401k. Like, they're not thinking about investing, and so they just participate in their 401k at their job or whatever. And I think people are starting to realize, like, there's more to investing. And I think crowdfunding gives people an opportunity to participate in investing in a different way. And your platform really reaches deep into the community. And when people are making $100 or a $200 or a $2,000 or a $5,000 investment, they're not really that interested in how much money they're getting back, as if they were investing $50,000 or $100,000 or $1 million. It would be all about the economic return. But when you drive down the size of the investment, the returns are much more focused on the change that you're making with that investment in that community. And that's one of the things I love about even the name of your company, Small Change, because you're putting in small change and you're making small change, but small change over and over again ends up with a huge impact. So I think there's absolutely a place for crowdfunding far more broadly in this country and in real estate.
Great. So I'm going to ask you 3 sign-off questions that I ask everyone. I'm just always interested to hear what people have to say. So what do you think is the key factor that makes a real estate project impactful to you?
So I think that the thing that makes a real estate project most impactful is that it made someone's life better. And there are so many people that can be impacted by one small real estate development. So if you appropriately and responsibly renovate a building in a place and you restore it to its historic integrity and you put really nice apartments that have, a beautiful place to live, the people that live there, particularly in the neighborhoods that CPC is in, have a better place to live. They didn't have an option to live that well before, and you made their lives better. So many times when we go to our ribbon cuttings, the tenants will come to the ribbon and cry about how happy they are to have such a lovely place to live affordably. And so I think their lives are impacted. But then just the everyday lives of the people that drive by that building, they feel better. It's not vacant anymore. It's vibrant. Something's going on there. And then it happens that the next building gets invested in and the next building. So you really make change and you improve people's lives. People meaning the individuals that live there, but also people meaning the communities that surround the real estate deals that you do.
Yeah, okay. So, and then this is a hard one, but if you were to pick one thing in real estate development in the US that you'd like to see improved, what would that be?
It is a hard one because I have so many thoughts on this. And I'm going to go somewhere which is kind of sounds a little bit weird, but I'm going to go to the building code.
Oh, I've heard lots of these, so it's not weird. A lot of people are thinking about building codes.
I think that if you could change the code and make the code require the right elements of place and housing and resiliency and sustainability and you can address so many things through the building code. I was in Pennsylvania Housing Finance Authority, a couple of weeks ago talking to them about their passive house initiatives and all the cool things that they're doing. And one of the people said, but Pennsylvania didn't have a building code 25 years ago. And that was really shocking to me.
No, they did. They're wrong.
Not a state code that impacted.
Maybe not a state. They were local. They were locally managed. That's correct. Yeah.
Yes.
And so they were all slightly different. Yeah.
But if you can start with a code that keeps everyone consistent, then all of the programs that grow up around real estate have to obey the code and they can all be more uniform and more efficient. So it's almost like the roots of the tree, and then the tree grows stronger because the roots are the same. And so it's a unique one for me. And I could have gone to all kinds of things, but I, particularly with my sustainability and my climate change hat on, change the code and you can change the way people fundamentally address those issues in real estate.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I plan to keep talking to you, Sadie. So thanks for your time this afternoon.
Oh, my pleasure. And I look forward to the ongoing conversation. Thank you, Eve.
That was Sadie McKeown. That was a fascinating conversation about the impact that personality, will, and politics can have on place. Political infrastructure is just one of the 5 criteria that CPC uses before they decide to invest in a place. In addition, they review physical infrastructure. What are the buildings like? Social infrastructure. Is there a there? Economic infrastructure and development infrastructure. You can find out more about impact real estate investing and access the show notes for today's episode at my website, evepicker.com. While you're there, sign up for my newsletter to find out more about how to make money in real estate while building better cities. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. And thank you, Sadie, for sharing your thoughts with me. We'll talk again soon, but for now, this is Eve Picker signing off to go make some change.